The silence in my lookout tower was a physical thing, a weight I had curated over 8 seasons. It was made of pine resin, old paper, and the ghosts of forgotten conversations. Up here, 2,000 feet above the valley floor, the world was a manageable diorama of greens and blues, a place I could observe without having to touch. My fortress was built of glass and wood and 100 miles of empty space. The rules were simple: watch for smoke, report the weather, and keep the world at arm's length. It was a code that had kept me safe, a form of self-imposed exile that felt more like a sanctuary than a prison. I had convinced myself that this structured loneliness was a kind of strength, an armor forged in solitude. I was tracking a weather system moving in from the west, a bruised purple smear on the horizon that the forecasters had underestimated. The air pressure was dropping like a stone, and the wind was beginning to keen through the steel struts of the tower. This was my element, a predictable chaos I understood. Nature didn't have subtext. A storm was a storm. It didn't pretend to be anything else. I was recalibrating the anemometer when a flicker of movement caught my eye on the trail below. A flash of bright blue against the darkening forest floor. A hiker, a late one, a stupid one. My jaw tightened. Hikers were a variable I disliked, a disruption to the tower's sacred quiet. They brought their noise, their questions, their clumsy intrusions into my carefully balanced ecosystem. I watched through the binoculars as the figure stumbled, caught himself, and then looked up, directly at my tower, as if sensing my gaze. He was a beacon of unpreparedness in a world that punished such things. The first heavy, cold drops of rain began to spatter against the glass, and I knew, with a familiar sense of weary resignation, that my sanctuary was about to be breached. The man started moving faster, a desperate, loping gait up the final switchback. He was coming here. He had nowhere else to go. The knock on the steel-clad door at the base of the tower was barely audible over the rising howl of the wind, but I felt the vibration through the floorboards. I descended the narrow spiral staircase, each metal step a small, resonant complaint. I was already composing the speech in my head. A terse but professional offer of the emergency shelter in the supply shed. A clear delineation of boundaries. I am the ranger, you are the civilian. This is a professional courtesy, nothing more. This was the lie I prepared, the first brick in a wall I was already building. I pulled the heavy door inward, and there he was. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 20s, with a face that looked like it was made for smiling, though it wasn't smiling now. Rain plastered dark hair to his forehead and ran in rivulets down his cheeks, dripping from the sharp line of his jaw. He was soaked through, his blue jacket useless against the deluge. He shivered, a fine tremor that ran through his entire body, but his eyes, a startling shade of hazel, were fixed on mine. They were direct, and for a moment completely stripped of artifice. "Bit of a miscalculation on my part," he said, his voice a little shaky but laced with a wry humor that felt entirely out of place. He gestured vaguely at the apocalyptic sky. The forecast said partly cloudy. I said nothing. I just watched him cataloging the details. The worn-out hiking boots, the too-thin jacket, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the strap of his backpack. He was a collection of mistakes, and yet he stood there as if waiting for an invitation to a party, not begging for shelter from a squall that was turning biblical. "Look," he said, his tone shifting, the humor draining away to reveal a raw edge of desperation. "I know this is a huge imposition, but the storm, it came out of nowhere. Is there any chance, can I just wait it out? On your porch? Anywhere? The rules, my code. A ranger provides aid. It was non-negotiable. But the rules were designed for anonymous, transient interactions. A map, a warning about bears, a bottle of water. They weren't designed for this, for letting the storm inside. "Can I share your fire? Will you, he asked, the question so simple, so elemental, it cut through my prepared speeches. He wasn't asking for shelter. He was asking for warmth, for a human connection in the face of the storm's cold indifference. I stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was an act of surrender. "Get in," I said. The words felt like they were dragged from me. "Upstairs before you freeze." He offered a grateful, exhausted smile that briefly remade his face. "Thank you. Seriously, I'm Noah." "Liam," I replied, my voice flat. I was already regretting this. I was a fortress, and I had just lowered the drawbridge. The space at the top of the stairs was to be generous, compact. It was one room my entire world contained within a 30-foot circle of glass. A bunk, a small kitchenette, a desk cluttered with maps and meteorological equipment, and in the center of it all, a small pot-bellied wood stove. It was the heart of the tower, and it was where Noah immediately gravitated, drawn by the radiating heat. He stood dripping on the worn wooden floor, a puddle forming around his feet, his presence a sudden, shocking disruption of the room's established order. Everything was suddenly wrong. The air, usually smelling of dry wood and old paper, was now thick with the scent of rain and wet earth and something else. The clean, sharp scent of him. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of his chattering teeth and the squelch of his boots. He had brought the wild, chaotic energy of the storm inside with him, and my small, controlled world felt like it was tilting on its axis. "You need to get out of those clothes," I said. The words were practical, necessary, but they hung in the air, charged with an intimacy I hadn't intended. My professional armor was already failing me. I turned away, busying myself with a stack of kindling, needing to focus on a task, any task. "There are some old clothes in that footlocker. Sweats, a sweater. They'll be big on you, but they're dry." "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer now, closer. I could feel his proximity like a change in atmospheric pressure, a magnetic pull. I didn't look at him. I focused on the rhythmic task of feeding sticks into the stove, the scrape of metal on metal, the familiar grounding ritual. I heard the rustle of fabric, the soft thud of his backpack hitting the floor, the quiet sounds of him stripping off the wet layers. My own skin prickled. Don't look, don't think. The storm outside escalated, the wind shrieking like a predator. Rain hammered the glass in sheets, blurring the world into a gray, churning chaos. The tower, which had always felt so solid, so unbreachable, now felt like a ship tossed on a violent sea. We were trapped. The thought landed with the weight of a physical blow. The path down the mountain would be a river of mud, impassable. He wasn't leaving tonight. He might not be leaving tomorrow. When I finally risked a glance, he was dressed in my clothes. A gray sweatshirt, old and soft from 1,000 washings, and dark sweatpants, both hanging loosely on his leaner frame. The sight was profoundly unsettling. It was an invasion, a colonization of my space, of my identity. He was wearing my skin, and yet the clothes looked right on him, comfortable. He was huddled by the stove, his hands stretched out to the heat, the firelight flickering across the sharp planes of his face, turning his hazel eyes to gold. He looked younger now, the bravado washed away with the rain, leaving something vulnerable in its place. I poured 2 mugs of coffee, the action wrote, automatic. I handed one to him and our fingers brushed. It was nothing, an accident, a spark of static electricity, but it felt like a brand. A jolt that shot up my arm and lodged itself deep in my chest. A sudden searing heat that had nothing to do with the stove. I pulled my hand back as if burned. He met my eyes over the rim of his mug, his expression unreadable. Did he feel it too? Or was this just another product of my over-analytical, starved imagination? He feels nothing. It was nothing. I retreated to the opposite side of the small room, putting the desk between us. A flimsy, pathetic barrier. I pretended to study a topographical map, but the lines blurred into a meaningless web. All my senses were oriented towards him. I was aware of the space he occupied, the way his body heat was subtly changing the temperature of the room. I could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing under the roar of the wind. It was a quiet, steady presence in the heart of the chaos, and it was undoing me. For hours, we existed in this charged silence. The storm raged, a constant, violent percussion against the glass walls of our cage. We were two animals trapped together, circling each other in a space that shrank with every passing minute. I watched him from the corner of my eye. I watched the way he held the warm mug in both hands, as if it were a lifeline. I watched the firelight carve shadows under his cheekbones. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, my own breathing unconsciously trying to sync with his. This is insane. I am a professional. He is a stranger. This is a temporary situation dictated by protocol. The lies were getting thinner, more transparent. Later, as the last of the daylight was swallowed by the storm, the power flickered once, twice, and then died. The humming of the refrigerator, the faint static from the radio equipment, it all vanished, plunging us into a deeper, more profound silence. Now the only sounds were the storm, the fire, and our breathing. The only light was the dancing, hypnotic orange of the flames. The darkness seemed to press in on us, shrinking our world down to the small circle of warmth around the stove. My carefully constructed barriers, my professional distance, they were all dissolving in the shadows. He was just a few feet away, a warm, living presence in the dark. And the urge to close that distance, to feel that warmth, was becoming a physical ache, a gravitational pull I was losing the strength to fight. "It's really coming down out there," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. It was the first thing either of us had said in hours. "It'll get worse before it gets better," I replied, my own voice sounding rough, unused. He looked at me, his face half in shadow, half in golden light. The manufactured confidence he'd arrived with was completely gone, replaced by a stark, unguarded vulnerability. "I was stupid. I should have turned back hours ago. I didn't want to." "Why not?" The question was out before I could stop it. It was too personal, a breach of my own protocol. He stared into the fire, a muscle working in his jaw. "I was running from a different kind of storm, I guess. Thought this one might be easier to handle." And there it was, the crack in his facade. The first glimpse of the real reason he was out here, pushing himself to the point of recklessness. He wasn't just a careless hiker. He was an escapee, just like me. We were both hiding up here on this mountain, running from things we couldn't name. The realization landed not with a jolt, but with a slow, sinking feeling of recognition. The armor he wore was just a different material than mine. My role, I realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, was shifting. I was no longer just the ranger. He hadn't just stumbled into my tower, he had stumbled into my solitude and shown me my own reflection in his exhausted, lonely eyes. The instinct that rose in me then was not professional. It was something older, more primal. It was the urge to protect, to shield this person not just from the storm outside, but from the one he carried inside him. I got up and walked to the footlocker again, pulling out the thickest wool blanket I owned. I went to him, my movement slow, deliberate. He watched me, his gaze wary, questioning. I didn't say anything. I just unfolded the blanket and draped it around his shoulders. He was shivering again, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. My hands lingered on his shoulders for a fraction of a second too long. I could feel the tension in his muscles, the warmth of his skin through the thick sweatshirt. My sweatshirt. The fabric was a conduit, a bridge between us. The rough texture of the wool, the radiating heat of his body, the scent of wood smoke and rain clinging to him. It was a sensory overload that short-circuited my analytical brain. All the reasons, all the rules, all the carefully constructed walls evaporated into nothing. There was only this proximity, this magnetic, undeniable pull. He leaned into the touch just slightly, a millimeter of movement, a yielding. It was a surrender, and it was a question. I pulled my hands away as if the contact had become superheated. I retreated to my bunk, turning my back to him, a coward's retreat. I lay down, fully clothed, and stared at the wooden wall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could feel his eyes on my back. The silence in the room was now a living thing, a pressurized vessel containing everything we weren't saying. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the tower, every roar of the wind was magnified, but the loudest sound was the steady rhythm of his breathing, an anchor in the storm. I tracked it like a lifeline. Inhale, exhale, a confirmation that I was not alone in the dark. For the first time in 8 years, the thought was not a source of anxiety, but a strange, terrifying comfort. I must have drifted off because I was woken by a change in the room's atmosphere. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. The storm had settled into a steady, percussive drumming. But it was the silence from the other side of the room that had woken me. His breathing had changed. It was faster now, shallow and ragged. I sat up, my own heart rate instantly accelerating. In the dim red glow from the stove's embers, I could see his shape under the blanket. He was curled into a tight ball, his back to me. A soft sound reached me, a choked, desperate gasp. My carefully constructed fortress, my professional detachment, it crumbled to dust in that instant. I swung my legs off the bunk, the floorboards cold against my bare feet. I crossed the small space in 3 strides, my movements silent, instinctual. I knelt beside him. "Noah," I whispered. He flinched, a violent full-body shudder. He was shaking uncontrollably. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I thought myself capable of. "It's okay, you're safe." He uncurled slightly, turning his head. His face was pale in the firelight, his eyes wide with a terror that looked ancient. He wasn't seeing me. He was seeing something else entirely, trapped in the grip of a nightmare the storm had unleashed. "Just a bad dream," I said, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. I reached out, my hand hovering in the space between us, unsure of the protocol for this. There was no protocol for this. So I threw the rule book into the fire. I placed my hand on his shoulder, the one not covered by the blanket. His sweatshirt was thin there, and the heat of his skin was immediate, shocking. He was burning up. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch again, more deliberately this time, a desperate, seeking motion. My hand, meant to be a gesture of comfort, became an anchor. The simple pressure of my palm against his shoulder seemed to be the only thing holding him together. "Breathe," I said, the command soft but firm. "Just breathe with me. In." I took a slow, deep breath. Out. He tried to follow, but his breath hitched, catching on a sob. The sound broke something inside me. The last of my defenses, the final wall of my fortress, came crashing down. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a civilian. This was Noah, and he was falling apart in my tower, in my world, and my only coherent thought was that I had to hold him. I moved without thinking, shifting from kneeling to sitting on the floor beside him. I tugged gently on his shoulder, an invitation. He rolled onto his back, and then, with a choked sound of utter surrender, he moved toward me, curling against my side, his head finding its way to my chest. He was trembling like a leaf in the wind. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, enveloping him in the blanket and my own body. It was a collision, a crashing of 2 solitary orbits. His body was tense at first, a knot of fear and anxiety, but slowly, pressed against the solid wall of my chest, feeling the steady, slow rhythm of my heartbeat, he began to soften. The violent shivers subsided into a fine tremor. His ragged gasps evened out slowly, painfully, beginning to sync with my own deliberate breaths. I held him. I just held him. My chin rested on the top of his head, and I could smell the scent of his hair, wood smoke and rain, and something uniquely, indefinably him. The rough wool of the blanket was a barrier, but it wasn't enough to stop the transfer of heat, of energy, of some unspoken, desperate need that flowed between us. He felt solid and real in my arms, a grounding weight that silenced the chaos in my own head, my loneliness, the constant low-level hum I had lived with for years, vanished. It was simply gone, replaced by the profound, overwhelming reality of him. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time had ceased to have meaning. The storm outside was a distant, muffled roar. Our world had shrunk to this single point of contact. The pressure of his body against mine, the sound of our shared breathing, the faint, dying light of the fire. He wasn't asleep, I knew. He was just still. A stillness that felt more intimate than any conversation. At some point, his hand, which had been trapped between us, moved. It slid up my chest and rested over my heart. He didn't grip, didn't clench. He just laid his palm flat against me, his fingers spread. I could feel the faint pressure of each individual finger through my shirt, a simple declarative act. I am here. You are here. I feel this. My own heart stuttered, then resumed its steady beat. Stronger now, as if answering his touch. My own hand came up, covering his, pressing it more firmly against my chest. A silent confirmation. I feel it too. The air was charged, thick with everything left unsaid. The lie of my professionalism, of my duty, was a pathetic, transparent fiction that had long since burned away. This wasn't about shelter anymore. It was about sanctuary, and we were, in that moment, each other's. The first hint of dawn was a subtle shift in the quality of the darkness, a softening of the edges from black to a deep, bruised purple. The rain had lessened to a steady, quiet drumming on the roof. The wind had died down, its shrieking rage replaced by a mournful sigh. The storm was breaking. Noah stirred in my arms. He didn't pull away, but his body tensed, as if waking from a dream and remembering the strangeness of his reality. He lifted his head from my chest and looked at me. His eyes, in the pre-dawn gloom, were dark pools, impossible to read. The vulnerability from the night was still there, but it was overlaid with a new uncertainty. A question, what now? My arms were still around him. His hand was still over my heart, my own still covering his. We were a tangle of limbs and unspoken emotions. The logical, analytical part of my brain, the part that had been dormant for hours, flickered back to life. It screamed at me. This is a breach of every rule. This is a line you can never uncross. Let him go. Rebuild the walls. Now. I should have moved. I should have cleared my throat, made a joke, put the professional distance back between us. It would have been the safe thing to do, the smart thing. I did none of those things. I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't try to hide what I was feeling. I let him see it all. The years of loneliness, the terror of this connection, the overwhelming, undeniable truth of it. I let him see that his presence in my tower had felt less like an invasion and more like a homecoming. The storm's passing, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It wasn't a statement about the weather. I know, I said, my own voice low and steady. He watched my face, searching for something. Reassurance. A sign. His gaze dropped to my mouth, lingered there for a heartbeat, and then rose back to my eyes. The air between us became thin, electric. The pressure in the room built again, a different kind of storm, silent and internal and infinitely more dangerous. This was the threshold, the final, irreversible step. He was waiting for me to make the choice, retreat to the safety of my solitude, or step into this terrifying, uncharted territory with him. I thought of the years of silence, of the carefully managed emptiness of my life. I thought of the way my heart had hammered in my chest when our fingers first brushed. I thought of the relief that had flooded me when I held him. The profound sense of rightness. The fortress I had built to keep the world out had also kept me a prisoner. Noah didn't break down my walls. He just stood outside them shivering in the rain and asked for warmth. And in letting him in, I had finally found a way out for myself. I tightened my grip, pulling him impossibly closer. I lowered my head slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, to stop me. He didn't move. He met me halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was a release of all the tension, all the fear, all the unspoken yearning that had been building between us since the moment he'd appeared at my door. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke and the lingering salt of his tears. It was the rough scrape of his morning stubble against my skin. It was clumsy and urgent and overwhelming. It was a confession. It was an answer. It was the complete and total demolition of the lie. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, foreheads resting against each other. The gray light of dawn was filling the room now, illuminating the beautiful wreckage of my old life. The world outside was washed clean by the storm, vibrant and new. The air inside the tower was still silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. "So," he said, a shaky, breathless laugh in his voice, "I guess I can't exactly go back to pretending I was just a lost hiker. And I can't go back to pretending I was just the ranger who helped you," I admitted, the truth of it settling into my bones, a warm, grounding weight. He pulled back just enough to look at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was the smile I had imagined when I first saw him. It transformed him, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Good," he said. The path down the mountain would be clear by midday. The world would intrude again. There were 1,000 complications, 1,000 questions about what this was, where it was going. But in the quiet stillness of the morning, with the smell of rain in the air and the weight of his hand still pressed against my heart, none of that mattered. I had spent years building a fortress to protect myself from feeling anything. Now all I felt was the terrifying, exhilarating reality of him. The storm had passed, but the air between us was charged forever. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the lightning. I was ready to stand in the rain. I made coffee, the familiar ritual now imbued with a significance that made my hands tremble slightly. Noah watched me, not from across the room, but from my chair, the one by the window, wrapped in my blanket. He didn't hover. He simply existed in my space, his presence a quiet hum that my body had already attuned itself to. The small room no longer felt constricting. It felt complete. I handed him a mug, and this time when our fingers brushed, neither of us pulled away. The contact was easy, familiar, a current that flowed between us without the shocking jolt of novelty. It was a language we were already learning to speak. He took the mug, his eyes holding mine. That gaze, the one that had stripped away my armor the day before, was different now. It wasn't searching anymore, it was seeing. And what it saw, it seemed to accept. We drank our coffee in the new silence, watching as the sun burned through the last of the storm clouds. Beams of light speared through the wet canopy, setting the forest ablaze with a clean, glittering light. The world was being reborn, and it felt like I was too. Every color seemed sharper, every sound clearer. The drip of water from the eaves, the distant cry of a hawk. It all felt like part of a symphony I was only just now learning to hear. "My car's at the trailhead," Noah said eventually, his voice still low, intimate in the quiet space. "Assuming it hasn't floated away. The outside world, the inevitable next step." A knot of the old anxiety tightened in my gut. This tower was our bubble, a pocket of altered reality. What happened when we stepped out of it? He must have seen the flicker of fear in my face. He reached out, his hand covering my knee. A simple, grounding touch. "Hey," I looked at him. Whatever that storm was I was running from, he said, his voice soft but firm. It doesn't seem so big anymore. He squeezed my knee gently. I'm not in a hurry to go back to it. The unspoken question hung in the air between us. And you? Are you in a hurry for me to go? I thought about the silence that would descend on this tower after he left. Before, it had been a comfort, a shield. Now the thought of it was unbearable. It would be an absence, a void shaped exactly like him. The scent of him would fade, the warmth would dissipate. The tower would become a fortress again, but this time it would feel like a prison. The trail will be washed out for another day, I said. The words were practical, a ranger's assessment, but the subtext was a plea. Stay. A slow smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes. He understood. A whole day? Guess I'm stuck here then. What a shame. The dry irony in his tone was a release, a small break in the emotional intensity. I felt the corner of my own mouth twitch upward, a smile. It felt foreign on my face, a muscle I hadn't used in years. We spent the day in a state of quiet domesticity that felt both surreal and perfectly natural. I did my morning checks, logging the rainfall, assessing the wind damage through my binoculars. Noah watched me, asking questions not as a tourist, but with a genuine curiosity about my world. He wanted to understand the mechanics of my solitude. I, in turn, found myself explaining the different cloud formations, the habits of the local wildlife, opening up this part of my life that I had never shared with anyone. He told me about the life he'd been running from, a high-pressure tech job in the city that was slowly sanding away his soul, a relationship that had ended badly, leaving him feeling hollowed out, adrift. He spoke of the constant noise, the feeling of being surrounded by people but profoundly alone. As he talked, I saw the parallels to my own life, just lived out in a different landscape. He had fled the concrete canyons. I had fled the emotional ones. We had both ended up on the same mountain. We cleaned up the small messes from the night before, moving around each other in the confined space with an unconscious, synchronized grace, a dance we were choreographing as we went. A brush of shoulders as he washed the mugs while I stoked the fire, a shared glance that lasted a moment too long while we folded the blanket. Each small interaction was a thread weaving us together, strengthening the fragile tapestry of whatever this was we were building. The physical tension of the night before had been replaced by a different kind of energy, a low, steady hum of awareness. I was constantly, acutely conscious of him. The way he ran a hand through his still damp hair, the sound of his quiet laughter when I told a story about a particularly stubborn bear, the way his eyes followed me as I moved around the room. It wasn't the panicked, hyper-analytical observation of before, it was a simple, profound appreciation. I was seeing him, and for the first time I felt truly seen in return. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the wooden floor, he found my small collection of books tucked away on a shelf. He pulled one out, a worn copy of a book on constellations. He settled on the floor, his back against my bunk, and started to read. I sat at my desk ostensibly working on my logbook, but I found myself watching him instead. He was completely absorbed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The light caught the stray strands of his hair, turning them to bronze. He was a splash of vibrant, unexpected life in my monochrome existence, a catalyst, the agent of a chemical reaction I never knew I needed. He had walked into my carefully controlled experiment and blown it all to pieces, and the result was something more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. The weight of my old life, the armor of the ranger felt like a costume I had finally taken off. I was just Liam, and he was just Noah. And we were here, in this glass box in the sky, in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, we stood side by side at the window watching the world reawaken. The view, which I had seen 1,000 times, looked completely different. It was no longer just a landscape to be monitored. It was something to be shared. I've never seen anything like this, Noah breathed, his voice filled with awe. It does this every day, I replied quietly. I guess I just stopped seeing it. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. Maybe you just needed someone to watch it with. His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. The fit was perfect. It felt like the closing of a circuit, the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The warmth of his palm against mine was a steady, grounding presence. It felt like an anchor. It felt like home. We didn't talk about tomorrow. We didn't talk about the trailhead or the city or the separate lives waiting for us down below. We just stood there, holding hands, watching the last of the light fade from the sky as a blanket of stars emerged. We were in a moment suspended in time, a perfect, fragile stillness. And for now it was enough. The lie I'd told myself for years was that I needed the isolation, that my strength was in my solitude. But the truth I was beginning to understand was that strength wasn't about building walls. It was about having the courage to open the door. It was about finding the one person you were willing to let see you, truly see you, and trusting them to stay. As the room grew dark, we didn't bother with the generator. The starlight and the low glow from the stove were enough. We moved back to the floor, to the blanket that had become our shared territory. This time, there was no hesitation. We came together with a sense of inevitability, of rightness. We lay facing each other, the space between us charged not with desperate tension, but with a quiet, simmering intimacy. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The simple, tender gesture sent a tremor through me. It was an act of deliberate care, of possession, of knowing. I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch, surrendering to the sensation. Liam, he whispered my name, and the sound of it on his lips was a revelation. Not the clipped professional title, but my name, spoken with a softness that made my chest ache. I opened my eyes. Noah. Saying his name felt like a promise. There were no more nightmares. We slept wrapped around each other, a tangle of limbs that felt less like two separate bodies and more like a single unified whole. His steady breathing was a lullaby against my ear. The weight of his leg thrown over mine was a comforting, grounding pressure. I had spent nearly a decade sleeping alone, and I had forgotten that sleep could be a shared sanctuary, not just a solitary retreat. I woke before him, in the cold, blue light just before dawn. He was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, the lines of worry and exhaustion erased. In sleep, he looked even younger, more vulnerable. The fierce protective instinct I'd felt during his nightmare returned, stronger now, solidified. It was a quiet, powerful force in the center of my chest. I wanted to keep this piece on his face. I wanted to be the reason it stayed there. I watched him breathe for a long time, memorizing the shape of his mouth, the flutter of his eyelashes against his cheek. This felt stolen, this quiet moment of observation. A gift. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if any disturbance might shatter the fragile reality we had built. But eventually he stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They found mine immediately, and a slow, sleepy smile touched his lips. There was no confusion, no awkward morning after recalculation, just a simple, profound recognition. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice equally rough. He stretched, his body arching against mine, and the casual intimacy of the movement sent a fresh wave of heat through me. He settled again, closer this time, his nose bumping against mine. "So," he said, his smile widening, "about that washed-out trail." "Still a mess," I said, playing along, "but probably take a week to clear, maybe a month." He laughed, a low, warm sound that vibrated through me. "A month, huh? You'd get sick of me in a month." "Try me," I said, the words coming out before I had a chance to second-guess them. They were a challenge, an invitation, a confession of a desire for a future I hadn't even dared to imagine 24 hours ago. His smile softened, the humor replaced by something deeper, more serious. He searched my eyes and I let him see the terrifying, exhilarating truth of what I was offering. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. It was slow, deep, and sure. It was a conversation without words. It spoke of acceptance, of understanding, of a shared future that was no longer a question, but a certainty. It was the sealing of an unspoken pact made in the heart of a storm. Later that day, we walked the first section of the trail together. The air was clean and cool, smelling of damp earth and pine. The path was muddy, and in some places small streams trickled where there had been only dirt before. The world was changed. Noah's car was where he'd left it, miraculously unharmed. We stood beside it, the reality of the outside world pressing in, the end of our isolation, the beginning of everything else. "So," he said, breaking the silence, his hands shoved into the pockets of my sweatpants, which he was still wearing. "The city?" "The mountain," I countered. He looked from me to the tower barely visible on the peak above us, and back to me. "I'm a better hiker than I am a tech drone," he said with a wry grin, "but I'm not sure I can pull off the rugged mountain man look full time." "You're wearing my clothes," I pointed out. "You're halfway there." He laughed, but his eyes were serious. "This isn't just a storm thing, is it, for you?" I stepped closer to him, closing the small distance between us. I reached out and took his hand, our fingers lacing together. It felt as natural as breathing. "The storm was the catalyst," I said, my voice quiet but sure. "It wasn't the cause. I think this was waiting for me. I just didn't know how to find it." I looked up at the tower, my fortress, my prison, or how to get out. He brought our joined hands up and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. "Well, for what it's worth," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I'm glad you got out." He didn't get in his car, not right away. We stood there for a long time, just holding hands, talking about nothing and everything. We made plans. Tentative at first, then more solid. He would go back, pack up his life, untangle the knots. I would wait. The idea of waiting for someone, of having someone to wait for, was a foreign concept, but it settled in my chest like a warm, glowing ember. When he finally did leave, it was with a promise. "I'll be back," he said. "Don't get too used to the silence again." I watched his car disappear down the winding mountain road until it was just a speck of silver in the distance. Then I turned and started the long hike back up to my tower. The climb was familiar, but my perspective was new. I noticed things I hadn't in years. The intricate pattern of moss on a rock, the way the light filtered through the leaves, the sound of the wind whispering through the pines. When I reached the top and stepped back into the small, round room, it was silent, but it wasn't empty. His scent lingered in the air. The blanket was still pooled on the floor where we'd left it. The coffee mug he'd used was sitting by the sink. He was everywhere. I walked to the window and looked out at the vast expanse of wilderness, my kingdom of solitude. It was still beautiful, but it was no longer enough. My world had been a map, a series of lines and elevations, a thing to be observed from a safe distance. Noah had walked off that map and into my life, proving that the most beautiful territories are the ones that are uncharted. He had shown me that a fortress is only a prison if you lock the door from the inside. The silence was no longer a wait. It was a space, a quiet anticipation, waiting to be filled. The storm had come and gone, and in its wake, it had cleared away more than just the deadwood in the forest. It had cleared a path for me, out of the wilderness of my own making and toward a new horizon. I was still a watcher, but I was no longer just watching for smoke. I was watching the road. I was waiting for him to come home.